Welcome to another episode of Judgement, which is a series of programs that we've been doing in the lockdown on a whole range of issues to help you through this particular process. And today it's a sheer delight to invite Ferial Haffajee, who's had an extraordinarily distinguished career, but I can't help but say that when I first met her, she was the assistant librarian at the Center for Applied Legal Studies, where I became the director. And to watch her career assume such stellar proportions in quite an extraordinary delight. She's now the associate editor of the Daily Maverick, but had a hugely distinguished career in journalism. Ferial, welcome.
Thank you very much, Judge. Great to be with you.
And so let me ask you, how do you read our political situation now? I mean, the president has done some quite decisive things in relation to the lockdown, but you write about this a lot, and I was interested in your view as to where you see us going as when we finally come out of this.
So let's stretch back a little bit to, I think that COVID-19 had the impact of freeing Cyril Ramaphosa to be the president he really wanted to be, because suddenly he was unshackled from party considerations. The fight back campaign, if you like, was put on ice as we faced this public health emergency. So he chose a smaller team, the National Command Council, to work with. And I think if you measure him by the three key speeches he's done as he navigates us through these difficult seas, I think he's really becoming the president that he wanted to be. But every day now you see how he is shackled by the impoverished state which got left behind in the period of state capture, which was so eviscerated in every possible way, from the fiscal to the to ethical, in every single way. And I think we're sitting now on the horns of that dilemma, where you also see today, I think, a real consideration that there are draconian measures being put in place because the state can't carry out or execute on this lockdown.
You mean draconian measures in relation to regulations, or draconian measures because the police seem to be doing sorts of things that they shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, both. So I think that we're moving as we speak now from lockdown level 5, what they call a drastic one, to level 4, which is called an extreme measure. But at the same time, for example, we're going to have a curfew put in place. And I've been speaking to people all day, and they say that we haven't had a curfew for all of the years of our democracy. And I'm not even sure why we need one now, because generally it feels to me like people haven't been going out a lot at night. So is that just the state using every possible measure in its hands at the moment? I'm not sure, but I do think that the moment requires extreme vigilance, because the police there have been so many complaints to IPID, the police watchdog, and there's absolutely no clarity whether any accountability will come from that.
So let me ask you a couple of questions about that as we move throughout the conversation. Sure. Just picking up where you are. It seems to me, you're right. I mean, obviously, why would you want a curfew? I mean, you and I can't exactly rush off to a movie or to a restaurant or anywhere else after hours. So I wonder whether the backdrop to this, which links to something else, which is the anecdotal evidence, and you probably have better evidence than I do, but the anecdotal evidence is that the police seem to be a hell of a lot tougher with black people in townships than they are with middle-class people in the leafy suburbs of the country. And I wondered whether this whole lockdown situation, in a sense, is discriminatory, in the sense that doesn't really matter to us, but maybe it matters more there.
Well, so the police have done, I think, I'm just going to check for you, but it looks like 118,000 dockets have been opened. I haven't seen the geographical breakdown of whether that is suburban or township or informal settlement. But what's pretty clear is that most of it has been related to the looting of liquor outlets, and that goes across the board from shebeens all the way to your tops at spot checkers, etc. and then a lot of it has been residential. So I think that gender-based violence has increased, and that's going to account for some of it when we see those numbers. But definitely the people where the greatest violence has been in the townships, where I think it's incredibly difficult to maintain physical distancing. Although I've seen quite a few incidents of really what for me would seem like policing, which you got to wonder, should it have happened? Should somebody who's letting their kids cycle on the pavement outside, should a dad be placed in jail for that? I think each of us can name many of those examples too.
Well, that's what worries me, because I hear about all sorts of people I know who take very long times to go to 5, 6, 7, 8 kilometers to go to the corner grocery store, meaning they wander around sometimes with their dogs and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And the police do nothing about that. And I'm really worried that the perception here is poor people always seem to get the brunt of law and order, two terms that perhaps are not quite the same.
So if I was I'll just refer to it because I was just finished watching it now. It does seem that the deployment has been largely in townships, largely in informal settlements, and then plenty of roadblocks to stop us moving across provinces. And where there's usually big commuter traffic, so a lot of police deployment has happened there. But I think when we see the IPIT numbers, it will be pretty clear that it is as per normal. This would be largely poor Black people who do not really have the capacity to find a lawyer and fight the police for what has happened to them.
That worries me. It worries me deeply, because it comes on to something I want to talk to you about presently, which is the future of constitutional democracy. But we'll get there. But then, just going back to your point about the wasted years, the state capture wasted years. I mean, if we had dealt with our spatial geography over the last 25 years rather better than now, then some of this wouldn't have happened, because many Black people would have been in, if you could call it, the urban areas, and lockdowns would have been much easier for them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the COVID-19 crisis, it's also showing us all the work we didn't do. The fact that 1 in 2 people could now be unemployed speaks to me, at least, of a labor market that has never been updated or has never been democratized or freed up. But obviously where it is most clear now is in the informal settlements and in the way that most townships still look, where physical distancing is absolutely impossible because people are still living in tiny, tiny houses, or indeed because our rural provinces like your Eastern Cape, your Limpopo, the Free State have been so denuded of economic activity, people have flocked to Johannesburg and Cape Town, and also to outside Durban, where we've seen the flourishing of informal settlements that the housing minister is now desperately trying to de-densify. Terrible word. I mean, we could have seen these mixed residence areas being developed. We've been speaking about them for over 20 years now, but you really haven't seen it happening except in tiny, tiny clusters.
Yeah, I mean, so let me then ask you, moving on from that, there is obviously a lot of anger, presumably, I know, within various parts of the country, particularly in the townships, about the sort of lousy treatment and the difficult conditions on which they're in. Do you have a sense that when we come out of this, going back to my first question, that we're going to act more decisively than we've done until now? Do you think that's possible? You understand, I'm looking for some hope.
Okay, so the optimist and the rose-colored spectacle person in me says, obviously we have to build on this moment. So like Arundhati Roy says, this pandemic could be a portal into a better world. But our history as a country is otherwise. So whenever we push to the brink, be it in 94, be it in 2010, where everyone thought we weren't going to pull off a wonderful World Cup, and we did, be it before every election when the prediction is of disaster and actually it ends up being quite peaceful. South Africa does well at the brink. We do less well in normal times. And so I really hope it's not going to just be back to business as usual, where we end up in our old anemic political fights of the EFF said or the DA said, and we for once grasp the nettle of what does the social compact look like and how do we achieve it more quickly.
But some of the commentariat, as it were, they call your lot.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that's the appropriate term, but let me put the media and commentators, some of whom are obviously I have a lot of respect for, but a lot of people are sort of saying, well, you can already sort of see the tensions within government between different approaches, and this doesn't bode well for when we come out of COVID-19 for decisive action, which will have certainty and predictability at its height.
Sure. So people see it as being, at the moment, a tension between securocrats and constitutionalists, or hawks and doves. And I think that those tensions are probably visible in cabinets throughout the world. But I think if our president was to take a page from the book of your Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, I'm not sure if you've been watching her, Angela Merkel in Germany, I think that the COVID-19 leadership book is written, and not a single country is out of the woods yet, but I think they do offer some examples of leadership and how to build on this moment. Obviously, Donald Trump is the antithesis of how not to do it. Huh?
Yeah, well, Donald Trump's antithesis of everything. But I find it very significant, and rightly so, that you've highlighted two leaders who both happen to be women.
Yeah, absolutely. I read a great article in The Guardian.
They are better than the men. And I say that seriously. It's very interesting.
Women leaders have done extremely well. Scandinavia is another case. Huh?
Correct. So the question then arises, Ferial, that given where we are, given the fact that there's a huge amount of structural differences within our society, what is then the future for constitutional democracy? You've been speaking about securocrats. You've been talking about people who clearly are not particularly enthusiastic about constitutional restraints. We see that all over the world, by the way. And I noticed a piece by David Lewis in the Daily Maverick of today, in which he talked precisely about those questions.
Sure. So I do think that this is a moment, Dennis, where those of us who consider ourselves constitutional Democrats really need to have our alerts on high. Because in a national state of disaster, you see the suspension of rights. And as we move from level 5 to level 4, you'd assume that those rights are returned. But what you're actually seeing is a higher restriction on movement, on commercial activity, on association. Many more of our freedoms appear to be, the constriction is growing tighter rather than lesser. And obviously, in a public health emergency, constitutional Democrats recognize that you do have to have a suspension of rights in order to fight an unknowable, difficult, killing, infectious virus. But I think what we're seeing right now demands that our very active civil society really goes to court if necessary and really ups the ante even more than it has before, to keep a watch, because I'm not sure who's written, I think maybe in Bronco, that we risked tilting into a state of emergency away from the national state of disaster. And for me, that's why the curfew is such a symbolic moment, is do we really need such a drastic step right now? Or is it to mask really terrible policing? A police force that's never been changed into a police service.
Well, we'll come to that in a moment, but just before you get there, I mean, it is interesting to me, point that you made, that we're led by a constitutionalist. If you look at the other countries which are using COVID-19 as a damn good excuse to be more oppressive, whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orbán in Hungary, Modi in India, Trump in America, or even Johnson in Britain, they aren't constitutionalists in the way our president is. So the anomaly here is that you're highlighting a similar problem, but where the leader in the country has very different position, as I read it, compared to, say, the leaders of those countries where I can get my head around it, because of the fact that they probably aren't, they're certainly not instinctive constitutionalists. Most of them are autocrats.
And obviously you must give deep credit to the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa is a quintessential constitutionalist. He was the chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly. He was instrumental in writing our constitution, and then the National Development Plan, which is very much a document born of the same kind of thinking. And you've seen that in this way he did it in terms of the law where the regulations are passed. But I think this is such a difficult virus, and the ground is moving so quickly under him that he can risk losing that commitment. And I guess that's where the activists in all of us have to come to the fore and speak up loudly and clearly, even though the instinct is to be consensus-seeking and united in the face of the COVID-19 virus.
But there's a point, I suppose, about this, that once you've got this activity from NGOs and others, people say things like, well, the scientists know, you're not a virologist or an epidemiologist, neither you nor I, nor as a civil society, you've got to leave it to them. Have we not now become a country or a world which, in a sense, goes back to almost Plato, where it is sort of the experts who run the place, not sort of humble, ordinary individuals who happen to be the
that's a fabulous question. And until last week, I was very much that person. But you can also see that the dangers of leaving it to the experts, because, for example, the other week, one of the ministers announced that there would be restrictions lifted on exercise, vital to national health. And then the health minister last night, when I was watching him on TV, was dialing back that, saying, no, you can exercise in your house. So I think even the power of the experts has to be questioned. And we always, I mean, for me, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and even vigilance over those undeniable experts. I think both you and I will agree that what's been so different this time around compared with the awful denialist years of HIV and AIDS, when the scientists were marginalized and that crazy crew was brought here for a meeting of AIDS denialists, is that this time the world's best scientists are on board. They're whispering in the health minister's ear. Decisions are taken based on evidence, and that's been refreshing and good. But I don't think you can yield your freedom completely to anybody. Huh?
No, except that I'm very proud of the fact that we have someone like Professor Slim Karim,
of course,
seems to me, who seems to be able to explain this better than any expert I've heard anywhere in the world. I mean, go away,
that's
Dr.
true.
Fauci. Our guy is much better as far as I'm concerned.
For sure.
Explaining to me what's going on. But here's the thing. Can I just shift that slightly? What do you think the responsibility of the media are in relation to experts? Because you've got a whole lot of people who come up with crazy ideas. I'm not just talking about Donald Trump's dettle. I'm talking about people who are doctors or purport to be doctors, and then they start saying, no, this, that, and the other. And much of it is actually debunked by the consensus among scientists. What's the obligation of the media in relation to publishing what they say?
Well, what I found very interestingly, both here and across the world, has been the flocking to good, high-quality media, because what we also have is an infodemic of unbelievable misinformation, fake news, panic. I'm sure you've seen it in your WhatsApp group. I've given up telling my aunt and uncle, please stop sending me if you gargle with salt water, it kills the virus. WhatsApp. I mean, it's been unbelievable. That's because our phone is so much of who and what we are. And then the flip side of that is people have realized, let's go to proper news sources. So the Daily Maverick, News 24, Times Live, Mail and Guardian, they've all seen a huge bump in audience because people are looking for factual news and also lots of news about COVID-19. They don't really want to read politics anymore. I was reading in the FT the other day. So that's been a good thing. But I suppose also to act as host to a kind of triage of the information you're getting, and yes, to hold up all the different views and all the different models and try to show people which of those is really the moment, and also teach people, because I'm not sure if you agree, but some of the initial modeling was so scary that it could sow panic and fear when in fact it's been proven not to be so. So to teach people, I guess, epidemiological literacy is also our view. Huh?
So let me ask you, I mean, you've been an editor of 2 major newspapers, I think maybe more, but certainly 2 that I know. And so you're now the editor of one of these, you're associate editor of the Daily Maverick. A big debate in America has been, when Trump gets up, it's hard to sort of say the president can't make a speech. We don't have that problem,
Sure.
but I'm focusing this on people who purport to be experts. And the question is, well, if you cover him as the media, what do you do about all his lies? Do you do commentary afterwards? Do you refuse to actually cover anything other than the factual parts that he gives? So I'm curious, as an editor, when you get for example, story from some maverick scientist, and we've had plenty of those that you mentioned in the HIV case, do you publish those, or do you publish them with something else to guide the public? How do we disseminate information that the public actually does the proper thing, rather than, in a sense, get information where it could be damaging to their health because they take the advice?
Sure. So I guess just looking at the US, it's been very interesting to me to see how, I think it's the Washington Post, which does the Trump checker, and they're maybe on about 18,000 by now, where they literally live fact check him and then hold as a thing for history all the lies that he's told. So I think that's a very important measure. And then locally, I think Professor George Claassen guides us very well here, and this is going to be written into the code, where certain things are given, like climate change is a given. So do you host climate denialists any longer? Many people are deciding, no, that you don't do that, where the science is perfectly clear, because that becomes then a source of massive confusion and disinformation in the public view. And my argument here is that today we shouldn't play host to your AIDS denialists, your anti-vaxxers, etc., because what you are doing is giving the very obvious disinformation a huge platform. And we've seen both here in the US, around the world, the dangers of that kind of science.
So we're running out of time, and I can't but help ask you, because we're talking about this. You yourself have been the subject of serious, vicious attacks on Twitter and the electronic media, and others like you have suffered similar consequences. How do we deal with that? Because it clearly is a problem for us, broader than COVID-19, to the broader constitutional enterprise of which we're talking.
So many countries are writing defamation laws for online defamation, because it's recognized as the next big threat to media freedom. Personally, I think that's a losing battle, and all you do then is further limit free expression and open it up to autocrats to misuse those laws. For me, the lobby has to be right in Silicon Valley, and that you're probably looking at class action lawsuits against your Facebooks and Twitters, the biggest hosts of disinformation, in order to make them change their systems, their algorithms, who gets onto their platforms, because they do have the abilities, the technological abilities. They've got lots of money to be able to take down those trolling armies and the like. But for me, the trick to getting rid of it really lies with the platforms and global civil society acting against the platforms rather than enacting more draconian defamation laws, because we've spent so long fighting those. Eh?
Sorry, yes, how worried should we be about it here? How worried should we be about the trolls and the Twitter and the whole Twitter sphere here? How worrying is this? Or is it something we can just write off?
Well, I think the fact that it was an infodemic that identified by the World Health Organization shows you how disinformation can literally become a killer if people begin to listen to it. In our country, just to make a very domestic example, the fight back was largely being hosted on social media through organized and paying trolling armies. When you've got an army of unemployed, tech-savvy young people, you can hire them for very cheap to click and engage those disinformation wars. So for me, it's an area of quite significant political risk. Not now because COVID-19 is everything, but it was something that I thought we should watch quite closely.
Well, I'm running out of time. Thank you very much. I mean, I suppose the real point of this conversation amongst many is your point that we often do so well in crises and then we waste a crisis, to quote others. And this is one we shouldn't waste. Thank you very much, Ferial. Thank you very much for joining us.
Bye, Dennis.
And you take care and stay safe, as everybody should who's watching this program. I hope you're all safe and healthy. Bye.